"Your designs are beautiful, but they lack commercial appeal," my business partner said, dismissing my sketches in front of our biggest potential client. The client nodded sympathetically. My partner, Vanessa Chen, smiled warmly and slid her own portfolio across the conference table. "Let me show you something more market-ready." I sat quietly in my chair, watching the client flip through designs that looked remarkably similar to concepts I'd shared with Vanessa 3 weeks earlier. The color palettes were mine. The silhouettes were mine. Even the fabric combinations were exactly what I'd proposed. But Vanessa's name was on every page, and she was presenting them as her original vision. This was the 14th time in 18 months that Vanessa had stolen my designs and presented them as her own work. I'd documented every instance, gathered comprehensive proof, and planned carefully for this exact moment. Because what neither Vanessa nor this client knew was that I'd already secured funding to launch my own fashion brand, poached our 3 best manufacturers, and scheduled a launch event for 2 weeks from today. In 48 hours, I would resign from our partnership and take half our client list with me. In 2 weeks, my collection would debut at New York Fashion Week while Vanessa scrambled to explain why her upcoming line looked suspiciously similar to designs I'd filed copyrighted 3 months ago. Her reputation was about to be destroyed, and I would emerge as the creative force I'd always been. Before we witness how a fashion designer whose work was stolen for years used legal strategy and industry connections to destroy her partner while launching her own empire, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes creative theft deserves the same consequences as any other stealing, and that stolen designs should be exposed publicly. If you've had your creative work stolen, if you've watched partners or colleagues take credit for your artistic vision, if you've been the invisible talent behind someone else's success, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and strategic planning overcome exploitation and betrayal. Now let's step into the world of fashion design, where a brilliant creative's work was systematically stolen by her charismatic business partner, where industry relationships enabled exploitation, and where 18 months of careful preparation created the foundation for complete professional destruction and personal triumph. My name is Rebecca Hayes, and I'm a 34-year-old fashion designer originally from Portland, Oregon. I grew up in a working-class family where my mother was a seamstress and my father worked construction. Money was always tight, but my mother made sure I understood fabric, construction, and the craft of making beautiful clothing from limited resources. I learned to sew when I was 7 years old, sitting beside my mother at her industrial sewing machine in our basement. She did alterations and custom work for neighborhood clients, and I would watch her transform fabric into finished garments. She taught me about drape, fit, proportion, and the technical skills that separated amateur sewing from professional construction. By high school, I was designing and making my own clothes, creating pieces that other students would ask about and want to buy. I sold custom jackets and dresses to classmates, charging just enough to cover materials while building a portfolio of work. My art teacher recognized my talent and encouraged me to apply to fashion design programs at major schools. I earned a full scholarship to Parsons School of Design in New York, one of the most prestigious fashion programs in the country. The scholarship covered tuition but not living expenses, so I worked 3 part-time jobs while completing my degree. I waitressed at a busy restaurant in Chelsea 5 nights a week, worked retail at a boutique in Soho on weekends, and did freelance alterations for a dry cleaner near campus. I was sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night while maintaining a perfect grade point average. The Parsons experience was transformative but brutal. My classmates came mostly from wealthy families who could support them financially, allowing them to focus entirely on their creative work. They could afford expensive materials for projects, take unpaid internships at prestigious fashion houses, and spend weekends visiting galleries and shows for inspiration. I was working during all those hours, exhausted and stressed about making rent while trying to compete creatively with people who had unlimited resources. But the financial pressure also sharpened my creativity in ways privilege couldn't. I learned to create luxury aesthetics with limited budgets, to innovate solutions when I couldn't afford expensive materials, to make design decisions that were both beautiful and practical. The constraints forced me to think differently about fashion, to question why luxury had to mean expensive materials rather than innovative thinking. My sophomore year project became a turning point. The assignment was to create a cocktail dress using only sustainable materials, with a budget of $200. Most students struggled with the constraints, producing designs that looked obviously cheap despite the sustainable materials. I spent weeks researching and experimenting, finally creating a dress from reclaimed silk and vintage lace that looked like it could cost thousands. The professor held up my dress in front of the class and said something I've never forgotten. She said the best designers don't need unlimited budgets, they need unlimited creativity and the technical skills to execute their vision. She said my work proved that sustainable fashion could compete aesthetically with traditional luxury, that the future of the industry belonged to designers who could make beautiful clothes responsibly. That validation changed how I thought about my career path. I wasn't just a student from a working-class background trying to compete in a wealthy industry. I was someone bringing a different perspective, someone whose constraints had forced innovation that my privileged classmates couldn't achieve. My background was an advantage, not a limitation. My senior thesis collection at Parsons earned top honors and was featured in the school's annual fashion show. The collection consisted of 8 pieces, all using sustainable luxury techniques I'd developed over 4 years of experimentation. I used dead-stock fabric from garment district suppliers, vintage textiles from thrift stores, and innovative construction methods that minimized waste while creating couture-level finishing. The centerpiece was a structured coat made entirely from reclaimed wool, with hand-stitched details that took me 3 months to complete. The coat looked like something from a Paris runway but was made from materials that cost less than $50. The technical achievement and aesthetic impact made it memorable to everyone who saw it. Fashion editors from major publications attended the Parsons show, and several wrote about my work as representing the future of conscious fashion. Vogue's online edition ran a feature about sustainable designers to watch, with my coat prominently featured. Elle wrote about how my work proved luxury and sustainability weren't contradictory. The coverage was more extensive than most student designers received, establishing me in industry consciousness before I'd even graduated. That recognition led to my first job as an assistant designer at a mid-tier contemporary brand in Manhattan. The company, called Modern Edge, produced workwear and casual pieces for professional women, selling through department stores and their own retail locations. It wasn't haute couture, but it was a stable job in a competitive industry, and I was grateful for the opportunity. I spent 3 years at Modern Edge learning the business side of fashion. I understood production timelines and how to create tech packs that manufacturers could follow precisely. I learned about cost structures, understanding how fabric choices and construction methods affected retail pricing. I studied the commercial realities that determined which designs actually got manufactured and sold versus which stayed as beautiful sketches that weren't financially viable. The work was creatively limiting but educationally valuable. I designed pieces that needed to appeal to broad markets rather than expressing my individual vision. I learned to balance aesthetic preferences with commercial requirements, to create clothes that were both beautiful and profitable. The discipline was frustrating but important for understanding how the fashion business actually worked. My boss at Modern Edge, a woman named Patricia Chen, became an important mentor during those years. Patricia had worked in fashion for 25 years, moving from design roles into creative direction. She understood both the artistic and commercial sides deeply, and she took time to teach me about navigating an industry where creativity and business were often in tension. Patricia encouraged me to develop my own aesthetic outside of work, to keep sketching and experimenting with personal projects even while designing commercial pieces for Modern Edge. She said the best designers maintained their creative vision while understanding commercial realities, that the goal was finding spaces where artistic integrity and business success could coexist. She also warned me about common pitfalls for young designers, particularly around partnerships and contracts. She told me stories about talented designers she'd known who'd been exploited by business partners, who'd signed unfavorable contracts that gave away rights to their work, who'd built brands only to discover they didn't own their own designs. She emphasized the importance of legal protection and clear agreements about credit and ownership. I should have remembered Patricia's warnings more carefully when I met Vanessa. I should have been more skeptical about partnerships that seemed too good to be true. But I was eager to launch my own brand, impatient with the constraints of working for someone else, and Vanessa's proposal seemed like the perfect opportunity. That recognition led to my first job as an assistant designer at a mid-tier contemporary brand in Manhattan. I spent 3 years learning the business side of fashion, understanding production timelines, cost structures, and the commercial realities that determine which designs actually get manufactured and sold. The work was creatively limiting but educationally valuable. At 28, I decided to launch my own brand rather than continuing to work for other designers. I had strong technical skills, a clear creative vision, and enough industry connections to make independence feasible. What I didn't have was business expertise, access to capital, or understanding of the operational complexity of running a fashion startup. The gap between my creative abilities and my business knowledge felt insurmountable. That's where Vanessa Chen entered my life, at what seemed like perfect timing but was actually the beginning of 18 months of systematic exploitation. I met Vanessa at an industry networking event in the Garment District on a rainy Thursday evening in October. The event was one of those professional mixers where emerging designers and fashion business people gathered to make connections, usually resulting in exchanged business cards that led nowhere. I almost didn't attend because I was exhausted from work, but I forced myself to go because Patricia had emphasized the importance of networking. Vanessa approached me near the bar after apparently overhearing me discuss my plans to launch a sustainable luxury brand with another designer. She was 31, polished and confident in a way I wasn't, wearing expensive clothing with the casual ease of someone for whom luxury was normal rather than aspirational. Her appearance suggested success and competence before she'd said a word. "I couldn't help overhearing you talk about sustainable luxury," she said, smiling warmly. "I've been looking for a creative partner with exactly that vision. Would you have a few minutes to chat about your plans?" We found a quiet corner and talked for over an hour. Vanessa explained that she had an MBA from Columbia and 5 years of experience in fashion marketing and brand management, working for 2 established contemporary brands before deciding to pursue entrepreneurship. She said she'd been looking for a designer partner who had both creative talent and a clear point of view about the future of fashion. She'd been particularly interested in sustainable fashion because she believed it represented the industry's future, that consumers were increasingly demanding both luxury quality and environmental responsibility. She thought the market was ready for a brand that could deliver both, but she needed a creative partner who could actually design and produce beautiful sustainable clothing rather than pieces that looked like compromises. Vanessa described her vision for a partnership where creative and business roles would be clearly divided. I would handle all design, product development, and brand aesthetic while she managed operations, marketing, sales, and fundraising. She had connections to investors who were interested in sustainable fashion startups. She understood financial management, retail relationships, and the operational details that most designers found boring or overwhelming. The proposal seemed perfect. I would get to focus entirely on creative work while Vanessa handled aspects of running a business that I didn't enjoy or understand well. We'd be partners rather than employer and employee, both building something together with equal stakes and shared success. The division of labor aligned perfectly with our respective strengths and interests. We met 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, fleshing out details of how a partnership might work. Vanessa was enthusiastic and full of ideas about brand positioning, target customers, and growth strategy. She talked confidently about raising capital, projecting that we could secure $200,000 in seed funding from her investor network. She had spreadsheets showing projected revenue and growth timelines. Everything seemed professional and well planned. I consulted with Patricia before committing to the partnership. I showed her Vanessa's business plan and asked whether the proposal seemed reasonable. Patricia read through the materials carefully and said the business strategy looked sound, that Vanessa clearly understood fashion business operations. But she emphasized again the importance of clear contracts and agreements about ownership and credit. Patricia specifically warned me to ensure the partnership agreement clearly stated that I owned my designs and would be credited as the creative director. She said many designers entered partnerships assuming creative credit would be obvious, only to find business partners gradually erasing their contributions. She said everything needed to be explicit in writing, not assumed based on verbal agreements or trust. I should have paid more attention to that advice. I should have insisted on more protective contract language. But I was excited about the opportunity and eager to start, and Vanessa seemed honest and collaborative. I told myself that Patricia's warnings came from cynicism born of long industry experience, that not every partnership ended in exploitation. We formed Hayes Chen Design Studio as a 50-50 partnership in January, with both our names on the company and equal ownership stakes. The partnership agreement specified our respective roles, my control over creative direction and Vanessa's management of business operations. What it didn't specify clearly enough was that I owned intellectual property rights to designs I created, or that I would be publicly credited as the sole creative director. Those omissions would later prove costly, but at the time they seemed like minor details. The contract was drafted by Vanessa's attorney, and I didn't hire my own lawyer to review it because that seemed expensive and untrusting. I signed the agreement after reading it once, focusing on the exciting parts about building a brand rather than protective clauses I might need later. Vanessa raised initial funding quickly, securing $200,000 from 3 investors within her network. The capital came from a successful tech entrepreneur interested in sustainable businesses, a fashion industry veteran looking to support emerging brands, and Vanessa's former Columbia MBA classmate who'd made money in finance. All 3 investors seemed primarily interested in the business model and market opportunity, asking few questions about creative vision or design. We rented a small studio space in a converted warehouse in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. The space was raw and industrial but affordable, with high ceilings and good natural light. We bought basic equipment including industrial sewing machines, dress forms, cutting tables, and fabric storage. We hired 2 junior assistants, recent graduates from fashion programs who were willing to work for modest salaries in exchange for experience. The early months were exciting and productive, filled with the rush of building something from nothing. I designed our first collection over 8 intense weeks, creating a cohesive group of 20 pieces that established our brand aesthetic. The collection focused on timeless silhouettes in sustainable materials, with construction details that elevated simple shapes into pieces worth their luxury price points. Every piece used either organic, recycled, or deadstock fabrics. I worked with textile suppliers to source beautiful sustainable materials, finding organic cotton sateen from Portugal, recycled cashmere from Italian mills, and deadstock silk from garment district suppliers. The fabrics were comparable in quality to conventional luxury materials but aligned with our environmental values. The construction methods minimized waste through pattern engineering that used fabric efficiently and techniques that turned scraps into design details rather than garbage. I developed zero-waste patterns for several pieces, creating designs where every inch of fabric became part of the finished garment. The technical challenge was significant but rewarding, producing clothes that were both beautiful and truly sustainable. Vanessa handled sample production, working with manufacturers to produce our first collection. She negotiated pricing with factories, managed production timelines, and solved logistical problems. She was competent and efficient at these operational tasks, and I was grateful not to have to manage those details myself. The division of labor seemed to be working exactly as we'd envisioned. She also created our business plan for approaching retailers, developing presentation materials and sales projections. She designed our lookbook and brand materials, though using photographs and styling I'd directed. She pitched our story to potential buyers, explaining our sustainable approach and market positioning. Her presentations were polished and persuasive, clearly the work of someone with professional business training. Our first collection launched at Capsule, a trade show for emerging designers held in a loft space in Manhattan. The show attracted boutique buyers from across the country, fashion bloggers, and press looking for interesting new brands. We'd secured a booth for $3,000, a significant portion of our limited budget but necessary for reaching retailers. The response exceeded our expectations significantly. Buyers loved the combination of sustainable materials and luxury finishing. They appreciated that our pieces didn't look like compromises but could compete aesthetically with conventional contemporary brands at similar price points. Several buyers said they'd been looking for exactly this kind of sustainable brand to offer customers who wanted environmental responsibility without sacrificing style. We wrote orders from 35 boutiques during the 3-day show, securing commitments for approximately $80,000 in wholesale orders. The number was much higher than typical for a new brand's first trade show. Fashion bloggers photographed our booth and wrote enthusiastically about our sustainable approach. We secured features in several online fashion publications, establishing media presence before our first products were even delivered to stores. The success should have been thrilling, the validation that our partnership and brand concept were working. But even during those early exciting days, I started noticing troubling patterns in how Vanessa represented our work to buyers, press, and investors. Small things at first, easy to dismiss as miscommunication or my own sensitivity about credit. She would describe design decisions using inclusive language like, "we decided," or, "our vision," when discussing pieces I'd created entirely on my own. She'd present samples without specifically mentioning I'd designed them. When buyers asked about sustainable construction techniques, she'd explain methods I'd developed without saying I was the one who'd figured out those approaches. During press interviews, she'd talk about our creative process, rather than clearly stating that I was the designer. When bloggers asked who designed specific pieces, she'd say, "Hayes Chen," rather than, "Rebecca Hayes, our designer." The language was subtle but meaningful, creating ambiguity about creative authorship rather than clearly crediting me as the sole designer. I told myself this was probably normal business language, that Vanessa was using inclusive pronouns to present us as a unified brand rather than emphasizing individual roles. I rationalized that we and our were standard ways partners talked about shared ventures. But the nagging concern persisted that Vanessa was being deliberately ambiguous about creative credit. The pattern became more concerning during conversations with buyers after the trade show. Several people mentioned being impressed with Vanessa's designs or asked me questions assuming Vanessa had designed pieces I'd actually created. When I'd clarify that I was the designer, they'd look confused, clearly having gotten a different impression from Vanessa's presentations. One boutique owner from Los Angeles told me directly that she'd understood from Vanessa that they'd both designed the collection collaboratively. When I explained that Vanessa handled business while I did all design work, the owner seemed surprised and slightly embarrassed, as if she'd been misled. The conversation made clear that Vanessa's ambiguous language wasn't accidental but deliberate erasure of my sole creative authorship. I confronted Vanessa about this gently after the trade show, mentioning that some buyers seemed confused about our respective roles. I suggested we should be clearer in presentations that I was the designer while she handled business operations. Vanessa agreed immediately, apologizing for any confusion and saying she'd be more careful about clarifying our roles. But her behavior didn't change. If anything, the credit theft became more systematic and deliberate over the following months. At first, I told myself this was normal business language, that Vanessa was using inclusive pronouns to present us as a unified brand. But the pattern became more concerning when she started taking solo meetings with important buyers and returning with stories about how impressed they were with her designs and her creative vision. The theft became undeniable during our second collection development. I'd spent weeks creating designs for a spring line focused on lightweight sustainable fabrics in a palette of soft neutrals and pale botanicals. I shared my sketches and fabric samples with Vanessa during our regular creative review meetings, walking her through my vision for the collection. 2 weeks later, Vanessa presented to a potential investor without inviting me to the meeting. She showed designs that were nearly identical to my concepts but presented them as her own creative work. I only learned about this when the investor later mentioned to me how impressed he'd been with Vanessa's design talent, assuming she was the creative force behind our brand. When I confronted Vanessa about taking credit for my designs, she acted confused and slightly hurt by my accusation. She said she'd been presenting our collaborative work, that she'd never claimed sole credit, that the investor must have misunderstood. She suggested I was being overly sensitive about credit and that successful partnerships required shared recognition rather than keeping score of individual contributions. The gaslighting was subtle but effective. Vanessa made it seem like I was being petty or insecure by wanting clear credit for my creative work. She implied that my focus on attribution was hurting our business relationship and making potential investors uncomfortable. She said successful founders presented as unified teams rather than fighting over who deserved credit for what. But the pattern continued and intensified. Vanessa started scheduling important meetings without me, presenting my designs as the company's work while allowing clients and buyers to assume she was the creative director. She'd return from these meetings with signed contracts and new orders, making it difficult for me to complain about credit issues when the business was growing. Our third collection marked a turning point in both Vanessa's theft and my response to it. I designed a fall line featuring innovative outerwear pieces using recycled wool and sustainable insulation. The technical challenges were significant, requiring months of development to perfect construction methods that were both sustainable and commercially viable. I was proud of the work and excited about its potential impact. Vanessa scheduled a presentation for major department store buyers without telling me until the day before. She said she'd handle the meeting alone since I was busy with production issues, which was true but also convenient for her purposes. I later learned from one of the buyers that Vanessa had presented the entire collection as her design work, describing in detail the creative process and technical innovations without once mentioning my involvement. That meeting resulted in our biggest order to date, a contract with 3 major department stores that would more than double our revenue. Vanessa was thrilled and wanted to celebrate our success. I felt sick knowing the celebration was for her stealing credit for months of my creative labor. That night, I made the decision to document everything systematically and plan my exit from the partnership. I couldn't continue working with someone who was systematically erasing my creative contributions while building her reputation on my work. But I also couldn't simply walk away from a business I'd poured 2 years of my life into building. I needed a strategy that would allow me to leave the partnership, take my designs with me, establish my own brand, and expose Vanessa's theft in a way that would destroy her credibility while establishing mine. The plan would take time and careful preparation, but I was committed to executing it perfectly. I started by consulting with an intellectual property attorney about my rights to designs I'd created during the partnership. The attorney reviewed our partnership agreement and explained that while the company owned designs created for Hayes Chen, I retained rights to my creative process and could create new designs using similar aesthetic approaches without violating any agreements. More importantly, the attorney helped me understand that I could copyright individual designs before showing them to Vanessa, creating legal proof of authorship that would be useful if disputes arose later. I began filing copyright applications for all new designs immediately, establishing a clear legal record that I was the creator. I also started keeping meticulous documentation of my design process. I photographed every sketch, saved every fabric swatch and sample, recorded dates when I completed designs and when I shared them with Vanessa. I kept a detailed journal describing my creative decisions and the development process for each piece. The documentation would prove my authorship if anyone questioned it later. Simultaneously, I began quietly building relationships with key industry contacts independent of Vanessa. I attended events alone, had coffee meetings with buyers and editors, and made sure people in the fashion industry knew me as the creative force behind Hayes Chen even if Vanessa was trying to claim that role. One particularly valuable relationship was with Marcus Rodriguez, a fashion journalist who'd written about our sustainable approach in several articles. Over coffee, I mentioned casually that Vanessa sometimes overstated her creative involvement in our work. Marcus raised his eyebrows and said he'd wondered about that, since my technical knowledge was clearly deeper than hers. He suggested I might want to establish my own identity in the industry separate from the partnership. That conversation led to Marcus writing a profile focused specifically on my design process and creative vision, published in a respected online fashion magazine. The article positioned me clearly as the designer behind Hayes Chen's aesthetic, with Vanessa mentioned only briefly as handling business operations. The piece was subtle but important for establishing my reputation independent of Vanessa. I also began developing relationships with the manufacturers and production partners who actually made our clothing. These relationships were crucial because they knew I was the one who created tech packs, approved samples, and solved construction problems. They worked with me directly on every production issue. Their loyalty would be to me, not to Vanessa, who rarely visited factories or understood technical production. While building these external relationships, I started secretly developing a new collection for my own independent brand. I worked on designs late at night and on weekends, keeping all sketches and samples in my apartment rather than our shared studio. The collection built on aesthetic themes I'd developed at Hayes Chen but pushed them in new directions that were clearly my evolution as a designer. I also began raising capital for my independent venture, quietly meeting with investors and explaining that I planned to leave Hayes Chen and needed funding for a new brand. Several investors who'd been interested in Hayes Chen were actually more interested in backing me specifically once they understood I was the creative force. I secured commitments for $400,000 in seed funding, double what Vanessa had raised for our original partnership. The planning process took 18 months of careful, patient work executed with the discipline and precision I'd learned at Parsons. During that time, I continued fulfilling my responsibilities at Hayes Chen perfectly, designing collections and managing production while Vanessa continued stealing credit and building her false reputation as a designer. Every stolen design I documented with photographs and dated notes. Every false claim she made to buyers I recorded in my journal with names and dates. Every piece of evidence I gathered systematically and stored in multiple secure locations. The documentation process became almost meditative, a way of transforming anger about theft into productive preparation for justice. After each instance of Vanessa taking credit for my work, I'd return home and spend an hour carefully documenting what happened, who witnessed it, and how it connected to previous patterns. The journal entries were detailed and specific, written with awareness that they might eventually be used as evidence. I photographed every sketch before sharing it with Vanessa, creating dated records proving I'd created designs before she presented them. I saved every email where I'd shared work with her, backing up the files in cloud storage and on external hard drives. I kept samples of fabrics and materials I'd sourced, creating physical evidence of my creative process and technical development. Most importantly, I built relationships with people who could later testify to my sole creative authorship. Our manufacturers knew I created all tech packs and solved all production problems. Our fabric suppliers knew I sourced all materials and developed all custom textiles. Our boutique buyers knew from working with me directly that I was the designer behind Hayes Chen's aesthetic. I also worked carefully to separate my creative development from Hayes Chen's business operations. The new collection I was designing for my independent brand was created entirely outside our shared studio, using personal equipment and materials I purchased separately. I worked on designs late at night in my apartment, keeping all sketches and samples completely separate from anything connected to Hayes Chen. The legal preparation was equally meticulous. My intellectual property attorney and I spent months reviewing every aspect of the partnership agreement, understanding exactly what I could and couldn't do. We identified the contractual provisions that would allow me to leave cleanly, taking client relationships I'd developed personally while not violating any non-compete terms. The attorney filed copyright registrations for my new designs as I created them, establishing legal proof of authorship before anyone else saw the work. We prepared cease and desist letters ready to send if Vanessa tried to claim rights to my new collection or attempted to interfere with my independent business. Every legal document was drafted and ready, waiting only for my decision to execute the exit. I also raised capital for my independent venture with deliberate strategy, meeting quietly with investors who'd understand that I was the creative talent behind Hayes Chen. Several investors who'd originally backed Hayes Chen were actually more interested in funding me specifically once they understood the real dynamic of our partnership. They'd been impressed with the designs and brand aesthetic, not with Vanessa's business presentations. One investor, the tech entrepreneur named David Liu, who'd provided $50,000 of Hayes Chen's initial funding, told me directly that he'd always known I was the creative force. He said Vanessa's business presentations were competent but not exceptional, that what made Hayes Chen interesting was the innovative sustainable designs. He committed $100,000 to my new brand immediately after understanding I planned to leave the partnership. I secured total commitments for $400,000 in seed funding, double what Vanessa had raised for Hayes Chen. The capital came from 4 investors who'd all done due diligence on my creative capabilities, my technical skills, and my understanding of sustainable fashion production. Unlike Hayes Chen's investors who'd focused primarily on business model and market opportunity, my investors were backing me specifically as a designer and creative director. The funding allowed me to plan a proper launch rather than a scrappy startup. I could invest in quality sample production, book a venue for New York Fashion Week presentation, hire experienced assistants, and build infrastructure for a sustainable business. The financial foundation meant my new brand wouldn't struggle the way many independent designers' first ventures struggled. While building this external foundation, I maintained perfect professional behavior at Hayes Chen. I met all deadlines, fulfilled all responsibilities, and gave Vanessa no reason to suspect I was planning to leave. She thought we were partners building a growing business together, completely oblivious to my systematic preparation for departure. There were moments when maintaining the pretense felt dishonest, when I questioned whether I should simply confront Vanessa about the credit theft rather than planning a secret exit. But I remembered Patricia's warnings about how confrontation often backfired in business disputes, how accusers frequently ended up looking unstable while the accused retained credibility. I also remembered that Vanessa had been systematically lying about creative authorship for 18 months. She'd been dishonest first and continuously. My strategic planning wasn't deception, it was self-protection against someone who'd proven willing to steal credit and gaslight me about that theft. I owed her no advance warning about consequences for her own misconduct. The timeline for my exit became clear when I secured a presentation slot at New York Fashion Week for the following February. Fashion Week was the industry's most prestigious platform, where established and emerging designers showed their collections to buyers, press, and industry influencers. Presenting there would establish my independent credibility immediately and dramatically. The presentation slot was competitive and difficult to secure for unknown independent designers. I was offered the opportunity because Marcus Rodriguez, the fashion journalist who'd profiled my work, advocated for me with the Fashion Week organizers. He told them I represented exactly the kind of innovative sustainable designer Fashion Week should be supporting, that my work deserved the platform. I scheduled my show for the Friday of Fashion Week, giving me 3 months to finalize my collection and prepare for launch. The timing was perfect strategically because it would force Vanessa to deal with my departure during the crucial pre-Fashion Week period when buyers were most active and attentive. I planned to resign from Hayes Chen exactly 60 days before my Fashion Week show, which fell on a Monday in mid-December. The 60-day notice period was required by our partnership agreement, and the timing would create maximum disruption for Vanessa while giving me legal protection against claims I'd violated partnership terms. The resignation meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on December 14th. I'd prepared everything carefully over the preceding weekend, with my attorney ready to file paperwork the moment I delivered my resignation letter. I'd already given advance notice to our manufacturers that I'd be starting an independent brand and wanted them to produce for me instead of for Hayes Chen. I'd contacted our major buyers to let them know about my upcoming Fashion Week show and to request meetings during Fashion Week to discuss orders. The preparations were comprehensive and irreversible. Once I delivered my resignation letter, there would be no going back to the partnership. The decision felt enormous and slightly terrifying, but also completely right. I'd spent 18 months being systematically erased while someone else took credit for my creative work. The exploitation couldn't continue, and strategic exit was the only path that protected both my legal rights and my professional reputation. That morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. despite barely sleeping the night before. I dressed carefully in professional clothing, wanting to look composed and confident for the resignation meeting. I packed a box with personal items from our shared studio, taking only things that were clearly mine and leaving everything related to Hayes Chen business. I reviewed my resignation letter one final time, ensuring the language was clear and legally precise. The letter stated my intention to resign from the partnership effective immediately, providing 60 days notice as required by our agreement. It clarified that I'd be starting an independent brand and would be taking client relationships I'd developed personally, which was explicitly allowed under partnership terms. The letter didn't mention credit theft or Vanessa's dishonesty. My attorney had advised keeping the resignation purely professional and focused on contractual rights rather than accusations. If Vanessa tried to challenge my departure or interfere with my new business, we had extensive documentation of her misconduct ready to use. But leading with accusations would make me look emotional rather than professional. I arrived at our Brooklyn studio at 8:45, 15 minutes before our scheduled meeting time. Vanessa was already there as usual, working at her desk with coffee and appearing relaxed and unworried. She had no idea that in 15 minutes her business partner would resign and take half the company's value with her. The studio looked the same as always, familiar and comfortable after 18 months of working there. Dress forms displayed pieces from our current collection. Fabric samples were organized in storage bins along one wall. Sketches and inspiration images covered our mood boards. Everything represented work I'd done, creative labor that Vanessa had systematically claimed as her own contribution. Walking through that space for the last time felt bittersweet. I'd built Hayes Chen's entire aesthetic, developed every product, created everything that made the brand successful. But I couldn't stay in a partnership where my contributions were erased and stolen. Better to walk away and build something new where credit would be clear and protected. Vanessa looked up from her computer and smiled warmly when she saw me arrive. "Morning, Rebecca. I wanted to talk to you about the spring collection schedule. I'm thinking we should push the timeline up to get samples to buyers earlier. If we can deliver by early February, we'll have better positioning for fall orders." The casual business conversation felt surreal given what I was about to do. Vanessa was planning future timelines while I was about to end our partnership. She was optimizing business operations while I was preparing to take those operations elsewhere. The disconnect between her assumptions and my reality was stark. I sat down across from her and placed my resignation letter on her desk. My hands were steady despite adrenaline making my heart race. "Actually, Vanessa, I need to tell you something important. I'm resigning from Hayes Chen effective today. This letter provides the required 60 days notice per our partnership agreement." The transformation in Vanessa's expression was immediate and dramatic. Her casual smile disappeared, replaced by shock and confusion. She stared at the letter without picking it up, as if not touching it might make it not real. Several seconds passed in complete silence. "What?" she finally said, her voice higher and tighter than normal. "Rebecca, what are you talking about? Is this some kind of joke?" "It's not a joke. I'm leaving the partnership to start my own brand. I'll be showing at New York Fashion Week in February, and I've already secured funding and production partners. This is my formal resignation from Hayes Chen Design Studio." Vanessa's face went pale, then flushed with what looked like anger or panic or both. She picked up the letter with shaking hands and read it quickly, her eyes moving frantically across the page. When she finished, she looked up at me with an expression that combined disbelief with something like betrayal. You can't just leave. We're partners. We built this together. You can't abandon everything we've created. This is insane. I kept my voice calm and professional despite wanting to yell about 18 months of stolen credit and systematic erasure. Actually, I can leave. Our partnership agreement is very clear about exit procedures. I'm following them exactly. You'll have 60 days to buy out my ownership stake at fair market value, or we'll dissolve the company according to the terms we both agreed to. But why? This doesn't make any sense. We're successful. We're growing. Our revenue is up 40% year over year. What possible reason could you have for destroying everything we've built? Vanessa's voice was rising, professional composure cracking under pressure. The question gave me the opening to state my real reasons clearly. I'm leaving because you've systematically stolen credit for my creative work for 18 months. You've presented my designs as yours to buyers and investors. You've built your reputation on my talent while erasing my contributions. I have extensive documentation of your theft, and I'm not willing to continue being exploited in this partnership. Vanessa stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly across the concrete floor. Her face was red now, anger clearly overtaking shock. That's completely ridiculous. We're partners. Everything we do is collaborative. You're being paranoid and frankly ungrateful. I raised all the money for this company. I built the business relationships that made us successful. You'd be nowhere without the structure and resources I created. The gaslighting was predictable but still enraging. Vanessa was rewriting history even as I resigned, claiming contributions she hadn't made while denying the credit theft I could prove. And you'd have no products to sell without my designs. The difference is that I've never denied your business contributions, while you've consistently denied and erased my creative contributions. I'm done with this partnership, Vanessa. The paperwork is filed with our attorney. My decision is final and non-negotiable. I stood to leave, picking up my box of personal items from the chair beside me. Vanessa moved around the desk quickly, positioning herself between me and the door. Her body language was aggressive, blocking my path in a way that felt vaguely threatening. You're making a huge mistake, Rebecca. You'll never succeed on your own. You don't understand business. You don't have industry connections beyond what I've built for us. You're going to fail spectacularly, and you'll come crawling back here begging me to rehire you as an employee rather than a partner. The threat was desperate and mean, the response of someone watching their fraudulent reputation crumble in real time. Vanessa was lashing out because she knew I was right about the credit theft, knew that Hayes Chen's success was built on designs she couldn't create herself, knew that my departure would expose her limited creative abilities. I met her eyes calmly, refusing to be intimidated. I have plenty of industry connections, Vanessa. Real ones, built on my actual talent and my relationships with the manufacturers and buyers I work with directly. You're going to find that out very quickly when those people choose to work with me instead of staying with a company that no longer has its designer. I stepped around her toward the door. She reached out as if to grab my arm but then pulled back, apparently realizing that physical confrontation would make her look even worse. Behind me, I could hear her shouting threats about lawyers and lawsuits and breach of contract. This is breach of fiduciary duty. You're stealing company resources. I'll sue you for everything you're worth. You'll never work in fashion again after I'm done with you. The threats were empty and we both knew it. My attorney had assured me that everything I'd done was legal and clearly within my rights under our partnership agreement. I had the right to resign. I had the right to start a competing business after 60 days. I had the right to take client relationships I'd personally developed. Vanessa's threats were just desperate noise from someone who'd built on stolen foundations and now watched those foundations disappear. I walked out of the Hayes Chen studio for the last time, leaving Vanessa shouting behind me. The December morning was cold and bright, and I felt simultaneously terrified and liberated. My professional partnership of 18 months had just ended in anger and threats. My career as an independent designer was starting with uncertainty and risk. But I was finally free from systematic credit theft and ready to build something where my work would be properly recognized. The next 60 days were intensely busy as I finalized my exit from Hayes Chen while preparing Rebecca Hayes' studio for launch. Vanessa tried multiple times to challenge my departure legally, hiring an aggressive attorney who sent threatening letters claiming I'd breached partnership duties. But her attorney eventually told her the same thing mine had told me. I had clear contractual rights to resign and to pursue an independent business. More devastating for Vanessa than losing me as a partner was watching our key business relationships choose to work with me instead of staying with Hayes Chen. The manufacturers who'd produced all our collections understood that I was the one who created tech packs, approved samples, solved construction problems, and ensured quality. They agreed immediately to produce for Rebecca Hayes' studio, leaving Vanessa without the production partners who'd made Hayes Chen's quality possible. Our fabric suppliers, who'd worked with me to develop custom sustainable materials and source specialty textiles, chose to continue those relationships with me rather than with Hayes Chen. These suppliers knew I understood fabric properties and construction requirements, that I could specify exactly what I needed for designs, that working with me was creatively satisfying in ways working with Vanessa never would be. Most critically, buyers who'd been purchasing from Hayes Chen contacted me directly to ask about my new collection. They knew I was the designer who'd created the work they'd been buying. They understood that Hayes Chen without me would be a business without its creative director. They were interested in following my work to my new brand rather than continuing to order from a company that had lost its design talent. I watched from a distance as Vanessa struggled to maintain Hayes Chen without me. She tried to hire new designers, but no one could replicate the aesthetic that had made the brand successful because that aesthetic was mine, developed over years of creative work. The designs she attempted to create herself were derivative and uninspired, clearly the work of someone with business training but limited creative talent. She also tried to claim publicly that she'd been the co-designer at Hayes Chen, that the brand's aesthetic was collaborative work rather than my sole creative vision. But the industry knew better. Buyers and editors who'd worked with us knew I was the design talent. Manufacturers who'd produced our clothes knew I created all the tech packs and solved all the construction challenges. When Marcus Rodriguez published an article about my departure and new brand, he included quotes from several industry sources confirming that I'd been the sole creative force at Hayes Chen. The article essentially exposed Vanessa's theft without me having to make direct accusations, letting industry insiders tell the truth about who'd actually created the designs she'd claimed as her work. My new brand, Rebecca Hayes Studio, launched at New York Fashion Week with a collection I was deeply proud of. The show was held in a converted warehouse space in Brooklyn, with a presentation that emphasized sustainable luxury and innovative construction. The aesthetic was clearly evolved from Hayes Chen but pushed further, showing my creative growth and vision. The fashion industry response was overwhelmingly positive. Buyers placed substantial orders. Fashion editors wrote enthusiastically about the collection as representing the future of sustainable design. Several mentioned that my work had always been the real talent behind Hayes Chen, with my new independent brand finally allowing my vision to be properly recognized and credited. The contrast with Vanessa's situation was stark and public. While I was being celebrated at Fashion Week, Hayes Chen was struggling with cancelled orders and production problems. Buyers who'd previously ordered from Hayes Chen were placing those orders with me instead. Manufacturers who'd produced Hayes Chen's collections were now working exclusively with my brand. Vanessa tried to present a collection at a smaller trade show the same week as my Fashion Week debut, but the comparison was devastating for her. Her designs were clearly inferior to what Hayes Chen had produced when I was creating the work. Reviews noted that Hayes Chen seemed to have lost its creative direction, with several writers pointedly mentioning my departure and suggesting the brand had been built on my talent rather than collaborative vision. Within 6 months of my resignation, Hayes Chen was struggling financially and creatively. Vanessa had lost most of our major buyers, couldn't find manufacturers who could match our previous production quality, and was facing significant debt from trying to maintain operations without revenue. The business I'd helped build was collapsing because it had been built on stolen creative work rather than Vanessa's actual abilities. Meanwhile, Rebecca Hayes' studio was thriving. My first season's orders exceeded projections by 40%. I hired a small team including 2 assistant designers and a production manager. I secured accounts with major department stores that had never carried Hayes Chen. Fashion publications were writing about me as an important emerging voice in sustainable luxury fashion. The professional vindication was satisfying, but more meaningful was finally receiving proper credit for my creative work. When buyers and editors talked about my designs, they knew they came from me. When manufacturers produced my collections, they understood I was the creative director who'd solved every technical challenge. My name was on my work, properly and permanently. I also made sure to publicly support other designers whose work was being stolen or undervalued. I wrote op-eds about creative theft in the fashion industry, spoke on panels about protecting intellectual property, and mentored young designers about documenting their work and ensuring proper credit. My experience with Vanessa made me determined to help others avoid similar exploitation. One particularly satisfying moment came when I won the CFDA Emerging Designer Award 18 months after launching Rebecca Hayes' studio. The Council of Fashion Designers of America Award was prestigious recognition from the industry's most respected organization. Vanessa had nominated Hayes Chen for the same award during our partnership but never won. Now I was receiving the honor for my independent work. In my acceptance speech, I talked about the importance of protecting creative authorship and ensuring proper credit in collaborative industries. I didn't mention Vanessa by name, but everyone in the industry understood I was describing my experience with her theft. The speech was quoted widely in fashion publications and resonated with many designers who'd experienced similar credit theft. Vanessa's response to my success was to try rewriting history about our partnership. In interviews, she claimed that Hayes Chen's creative work had been collaborative, that she'd been equally involved in design decisions, that my success was built on foundations we'd created together. But no one believed her revision because too many industry insiders knew the truth. Buyers told stories about meetings where Vanessa clearly didn't understand technical construction details. Manufacturers described how I'd been the only person who could create tech packs or solve production problems. Editors remembered interviews where Vanessa struggled to discuss creative inspiration or design process. The evidence of her limited creative involvement was overwhelming and public. The final collapse of Hayes Chen came about 2 years after my departure. Vanessa had accumulated significant debt trying to maintain operations without revenue, and her attempts to create new designs were consistently unsuccessful. She filed for bankruptcy, closed the business, and left the fashion industry entirely. The brand that had been built on my stolen work disappeared once I took my talent elsewhere. I felt no particular satisfaction in Hayes Chen's failure. The business could have continued successfully if Vanessa had been honest about our respective contributions and willing to share credit appropriately. Her theft and ego destroyed something that could have been sustainable if she'd had the integrity to acknowledge my creative work properly. 3 years after launching Rebecca Hayes' studio, I'm 37 years old and running a thriving independent fashion brand. We produce 4 collections annually, sell through 50 retail partners globally, and have been featured in every major fashion publication. I've built a team of 12 people, all of whom are properly credited for their contributions to our work. The experience with Vanessa taught me important lessons about creative theft and the importance of documentation, legal protection, and strategic planning. I learned that exploitation often continues as long as victims accept it, and that exposing theft requires both courage and careful preparation. I've become an advocate for creative rights in the fashion industry, working with organizations that help designers protect their intellectual property and ensure proper credit for their work. I speak regularly at design schools about contracts, partnerships, and the legal protections designers should have in place before collaborating with business partners. One meaningful project has been creating a legal resource guide for emerging designers, providing template contracts and intellectual property guidance that I wish I'd had when starting Hayes Chen. The guide is freely available and has been used by hundreds of young designers to protect themselves from exploitative partnerships. I still see Vanessa occasionally at industry events, though she's no longer working in fashion. She tried briefly to reinvent herself as a fashion consultant but found few clients willing to work with someone known for taking credit for others' creative work. Her reputation never recovered from the exposure of her theft and Hayes Chen's collapse. We don't speak when we see each other. There's nothing to say. She destroyed our partnership through theft and ego, and I responded by building something better without her. The outcome speaks for itself. I'm thriving with proper credit for my work, while she's unemployable in the industry she tried to exploit. The fashion industry has long memory for creative theft and fraud. Vanessa Chen will always be known as the business partner who stole credit from her designer, built a brand on someone else's talent, and collapsed when that talent left. That reputation follows her permanently, making any return to fashion impossible. Meanwhile, I'm recognized as a designer who not only creates beautiful sustainable fashion but also had the courage and strategic intelligence to leave an exploitative partnership and build an independent success. That reputation brings opportunities, respect, and the satisfaction of knowing I fought for proper credit for my creative work. If this story resonates with you, if you've had your creative work stolen in fashion or any artistic field, remember that documentation is protection and strategic planning beats impulsive reaction. Protect your intellectual property legally before sharing creative work. Build relationships independent of exploitative partners. Plan your exit carefully before acting. Hit subscribe to join our community that believes creative theft deserves exposure and consequences. Share this with someone whose artistic work is being exploited by partners or colleagues who won't give proper credit. And remember that the best response to creative theft is building undeniable success with proper authorship. The designer whose work was stolen for 18 months built an independent brand that outperformed the partnership built on her stolen designs. The business partner who claimed credit for creative work she didn't do lost everything when the actual talent left and took the industry relationships with her. Sometimes justice comes from patient planning and strategic exit rather than immediate confrontation. Sometimes the best revenge is succeeding spectacularly while the thief struggles publicly. Sometimes protecting your creative work means walking away from what you built and building something better where you control the credit. Vanessa thought she could build a fashion career on my stolen designs because business skills matter in the industry. She was half right. Business skills do matter. But creative talent matters more, and once I left with my talent, her business skills couldn't save a brand with no genuine creative direction. The partner who presented my sketches as her designs watched from a distance as I won industry awards for my independent work. The woman who'd erased my creative contributions struggled to create anything original herself. And the designer who'd been invisible for 18 months finally received the recognition her work deserved. That's what happens when you steal credit from someone patient enough to document everything and strategic enough to plan a perfect exit. You think you're building a reputation. Actually, you're building on foundation that will disappear the moment your victim decides to leave and take their talent with them. Vanessa learned this lesson watching Hayes Chen collapse while Rebecca Hayes' studio thrived. And the fashion industry learned that creative theft, even theft disguised as partnership and collaboration, would eventually be exposed when victims had the courage to leave and the talent to succeed independently. The invisible designer became the celebrated independent creator. The credit thief became unemployable. And the work that had been stolen finally carried the right name, establishing a reputation built on actual talent rather than exploitation and lies.